Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Teaching English webinar for teacher educators. My name is Shirin Soros, and I'll be your moderator today. Thank you all so much for joining this live event. This is a review webinar, and our panel of speakers will reflect on the main insights from our teacher educator webinar series, and we'll also look at the future themes. As usual, before we start our session, I'd like to share a number of quick housekeeping reminders with you. While waiting, please share with us in the Q&A where you are from. If you work in pre-service teacher education, type pre-service. If you work in in-service, type in-service in the Q&A. This session is being recorded, and a recording of the webinar will be available on Teaching English in the next couple of days. And you will have a chance to ask questions to our presenters. Please use the Q&A to ask our presenters your questions. We'll be using the chat for announcements. So let me briefly go through what we'll discuss today. So first of all, I'm pleased to announce that some of our previous presenters are with us today in the webinar, and I'd like to extend a warm welcome to them and thank them for joining us. They will have a panel discussion soon, and we'll take a look back at the main points and research insights from our webinar series. So we conducted a pre-webinar poll to gather insights from you, and I'll share the results with you. And we also received feedback from our audience. We'll reflect on this feedback together, and we'll have a panel discussion of key points. And we'll be looking at the program themes for the next series for 2023-2024. So we prepared a video about our webinar series. We had a great lineup of expert presenters who shared their insights on various topics related to teacher educators. So you can see our presenters here who is with us today, so you can see their names on the screen. And so we also conducted a pre-webinar poll to gather insights from you. And thank you so much, first of all, for joining. And I'd like to share the results with you. So we asked you a question: to what extent do you agree with the following statements? And there were 7 statements. So the first statement was good face-to-face teacher educators may not automatically be good virtual teacher educators. So the majority of the respondents strongly agree with this statement, suggesting that virtual teaching requires a different set of skills than face-to-face teaching. So this highlights the need for teacher educators to develop their skills, their own skills to support online teaching. The second statement is we should think carefully about how to create a gender-sensitive training environment. We need to think about language we use, how we interact with teachers and our training materials. So similarly to the first statement, the majority of respondents strongly agree with the need to create a gender-sensitive training environment. So this suggests that as teacher educators, we should be mindful of the language we use and how we interact with our teachers and ensure that our training materials are inclusive of all genders. The third statement is, as teacher educators, we should conduct our own research and encourage teachers to do the same. So a majority of respondents strongly agree with this statement, while 37% agree. This suggests that there is a value in teacher educators conducting their own research and encouraging teachers to do the same, although a small proportion disagreed. So maybe we need to investigate this. Maybe this is an indication of lack of confidence in research. So this is something we are planning to work in the next years. And we must understand the challenges of online teaching and help teachers find solutions beyond just technical skills. This is the fourth statement. And the vast majority of respondents again strongly agree with this statement, highlighting the need for teacher educators to understand the unique challenges of online teaching and help teachers find solutions beyond just technical skills. The fifth statement is we need to pay attention to the whole teacher, not just their skills in the classroom. We should encourage their career-long motivation, belongingness, and resilience. Again, the majority of respondents strongly agree emphasizing the importance of teacher educators focusing on the holistic development of teachers, not just skills in the classroom. The sixth statement says teacher associations can help teachers develop and become effective agents in their professional development. The fact that 62% of the respondents agree with this statement, and this suggests that teacher associations can be valuable resources for teacher educators. The findings also highlight the importance of creating professional networks and communities of practice that can support ongoing learning and development. Finally, the final statement says that to help learners reach their potential, we should use the social model of disability and engage in a good inclusive practices. So the fact that 42% of respondents strongly agree with this statement, and this suggests there is a need for teacher educators to be well equipped to support learners with diverse needs. So this also suggests that a social model of disability and good inclusive practices are necessary to help all learners reach their potential. So this is just a summary. Once again, thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate your support and we look forward to a great webinar ahead. So without further ado, let's begin reflecting on the key insights from our previous series with the help of John Shackleton, the global lead for ELT in education, and our presenters.
Thanks very much indeed, Sharon. I just realized I've got a wild haircut. I'll sort that out though. Welcome everybody. It's great that you're with us here today. So as Sharon was saying, we're taking the opportunity to review some of the key points that we've come across through the webinar series so far, webinar series number 1. Key points to think about, to reflect upon, and to integrate into what we do as teacher educators to support teachers. We think review as a thing is very important. We think it's something that teachers can do with their learners. We think it's something that teacher educators can do with the teachers that they support. So we think it's a really important part of learning in general, the opportunity to review, to think back, to look back, to reflect on some of the elements that we've covered, some of the themes that we've covered in the webinar series. So please put any questions or any comments in the Q&A box, and we'll do our best to get to as many of those as we can with Shirin's help. So what I would like to do now then is to move on to the first of our webinars. The theme for that, you can see it on the screen. You had a glimpse of it in a different format for the pre-webinar poll. So essentially, it's about thinking carefully when we're talking about the transfer of face-to-face skills for teacher educators from that face-to-face environment into the virtual environment. Our contention is that we shouldn't assume that that is an automatic transference and that teacher educators need help and support so that they themselves can support teachers adequately and effectively in the online environment. I'm going to ask Alan, if I may. Alan, are you with us?
Yes.
Excellent. I'm going to ask Alan for his initial thoughts on that particular topic. Alan, what do you think?
Well, I think with the onset of the pandemic, there was perhaps an assumption that we can simply, as teacher educators, that we can simply transfer our face-to-face skills unproblematically into an online environment. And this was something that we were all faced with, and some people managed that transition more smoothly than others. But I think we all discovered that there are ways of doing things in the virtual environment that are specific to that environment, that there are skills to learn, different modes of interaction to consider, and different procedures just to get used to. the pandemic certainly accelerated the acquisition of those skills. It was a very steep and rapid learning curve, and generally it succeeded in enlarging the skill sets of teacher educators, but inevitably it felt like a very rushed process. It had to be. Simon, this was the focus of your research, and I wonder what your findings indicated.
Yeah, thanks, Alan, for that comment on the session, and hello to everyone. Thanks for joining us today. So I think if I had to summarize the key points from my webinar, I think there were two overall issues we want to remind everyone about. Firstly, in terms of the competences that teacher educators need to work online effectively, we broke them down into 3 groups in the webinar. We had these general digital competences. This is just a general knowledge of how to use technology in life generally. I think that underpins other uses of technology. The second group was the pedagogic digital competences, so knowing how to use technology to enhance teaching and learning, and in our case, how to use it to support teacher learning. And the third group we called professional digital competences. So that was using technology for the purposes of furthering our own professional development. So in the webinar, when we talked about the kinds of competences that teacher educators need to develop to work effectively online, there were those 3 groups: general, pedagogic, and professional. So that was one key point, I think, that we emphasized in the webinar. The second important point that we highlighted was that effective online teacher education has certain common characteristics, and we highlighted some of those in the webinar, and I'll just remind you of those. One, and a lot of people would, most important one, was a positive social environment. So there's plenty of evidence that working online, I think this is generally not just for teacher education, is going to be more effective when positive social learning atmosphere is established, positive social relations are established. So if you are working with teachers online, it's important not to ignore that very important aspect of the process, because it facilitates everything else. But in addition to positive social environment, we also emphasized the importance of appropriate use of tools in online environments. And that means we need to know which tools are available. We need to be able to select tools and use them appropriately. We need tasks that promote deep learning. And again, this applies to learning generally, but it assumes a specific meaning in an online context. So clearly, a lot of talk in an online context is not necessarily the best way to promote deep learning. We need to think of ways in which we can engage teachers more effectively. And the final element in effective online teacher education that we mentioned in the webinar was the need for sufficient support for participants. Many of the teachers we work with in online environments will have varying levels of competence and confidence in the online environment. and we need to understand what their needs are and to provide appropriate support for them. So those were the two big points from the webinar: the different types of competences that online teacher educators need to work effectively online, and the characteristics of effective online teacher education environments. And with that, I'll hand back to John. Thank you.
Simon, Alan, thank you very much indeed. Some very, very insightful comments there. And I think what that goes to underline, I think, is the importance of the webinar program in terms of stimulating the kind of considered reflection, a look at the evidence base. If you remember, we associated Simon's how-to guide with the webinar. So if you get a chance, do please look back at that research as well. And I think fundamentally it's about considering the online environment anew, afresh, and not being in a position where you feel forced into doing things that you're perhaps not necessarily ready to do, and that there is no automatic transfer of skills that you may have developed in a face-to-face environment necessarily into the online environment. So lots to think about there. And I think that's the key to this webinar series. It's about consideration, it's about thinking, it's about a review of the evidence base to make sure that when we make decisions in the training room and therefore in the classroom, that they are considered and well thought through. Thank you very much then. If we can move on now to the next slide and the next theme, that'd be good.
Okay, hi everybody. I think what I'd like to say, and Ellen will obviously come back on, is that I think it's obvious that we want to ensure that our resources, materials, our training approaches relate to our learners' needs and interests. And certainly if we're thinking about gender or even diversity more broadly, but obviously this one is focused on gender, this is not always the case in course books, in resources we use, and in actual materials. So I think we have to be really kind of super sensitive about this. A term that often comes up is actually unconscious bias. We all have unconscious biases, but thinking about our role and responsibility as teacher educators when we're working with teachers to be really thinking about this and ensuring that everything we do is actually representative. And so as I say, this is focused on gender and really making sure that we take what I'd say is a kind of broad approach as well. Yes, it's making sure we're representative, but it's also that we don't actually stereotype as well. And so it's really, I think, important that we have got the broadest possible range of resources and materials that can actually support our learners when we're focused on issues around gender. So I'll leave that there, and over to you, Ellen.
Oh, thanks very much, Phil, for that response to this particular piece of learning from the webinar series. I didn't give this webinar, Laura gave this webinar, and so to prepare for this, I reviewed her webinar and looked at the kinds of things that leapt out at me as important for creating a gender sensitive training environment. So Laura gave us some really useful and practical activities in, as you said, Phil, raising awareness of our own stereotypes, of our own assumptions, of thoughts about gender privilege, and about the language we use when we talk about gender. She also, as you said, John, brought in research about observations of teachers working in classrooms, SADCA and SADCA research from 1994, which looked at how teachers interact more with boys than with girls, how boys in their research were seen to be able to shout out more despite classroom rules, And that struck me as a very interesting point and something that we could use as teacher educators to raise awareness with teachers of their practice by turning that into an observation task, for example, that they could use themselves to reflect upon their teaching practice, or a teacher educator could use in observation of them and then reflect back to them and make them aware of their interactions in the classroom. And Laura also talked a lot about materials and how we need to equip teachers to be able to analyse them, change them, adapt them with the learners that we're working with, and also to decide what to do when you do come across biased material. That could actually be a learning point with teachers and learners, couldn't it, if you call that out in the classroom and make a discussion point of it. And then I wanted to extend on those thoughts a little bit about my own sort of reactions to that, and thinking that, as you said, we are a very powerful role model for our teachers and for our learners. And therefore, I also thought about unconscious bias. And therefore, as teacher educators, if we can seek out some unconscious bias training, that could really help us in developing our own attitudes and our own awareness of the biases that we have. And in turn, that will filter down to our teachers and to our learners. And then also picking up on this idea that it's we need to think carefully and continuously, so continuously reflecting on our decision making and choices, and seeking feedback from our teachers to identify where bias may be present. And that actually relates back to what Simon was saying about creating a positive social environment. If we listen to our learners and our teachers, and we take feedback from them, that's going to also contribute to a more comfortable and sociable environment in our training sessions and when we're working with teachers. And then I also wanted, if I could just take a little moment to plug a new book that we've just produced, which has come out of some research that the British Council has funded in 10 countries around the world. I think Andrea's put the link in the chat box. It's called Gender Equality in English Language Teaching Practice, a resource book for teacher education. And it's been written by future or current English language teachers. They have written essays about their own experiences of gender in English language teaching. And then the essays have been supplemented with additional activities, pre-reading reflection, post-reading discussion, and practical tasks. And there's a very broad diversity of different experiences in different contexts that can be a useful springboard for discussion around this area if you're doing a workshop on teacher education and gender in ELT. Then I thoroughly recommend downloading that book and getting some ideas from there. That's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Ellen and Phil. Some, I think, really interesting general points in there. I mean, you talk about examining our own behaviour and how important it is as a teacher educator, given our role in supporting the professional development of teachers and how that will affect learning engagement and learning outcome in the classroom. It is tremendously important, isn't it, to continuously, as you say, reflect on our behaviour. And I think there are a couple of comments that have come in the Q&A, for example, around freedom. And I think one of the things that the power, if you like, of reflecting on your own behaviour is that it's a conduit to greater freedom, in the sense that you feel more comfortable with the kind of decisions that you're making because you've thought long and hard about the theme, for example, and you've looked at the evidence base. And I think that's important. Another point about gender fluidity, And I think this perhaps comes back to two things that Alan and Simon were talking about, but also Phil was talking about, a general sense about putting the learner, or in our case, the teacher, at the center of what it is that we do, and being mindful and respectful of the teacher as an individual that may have all sorts of different needs, but not to consider teachers that you're supporting as a mass in the same way as we would advise teachers, wouldn't we, not to think about their learners as a mass, but to focus on the development of the individual, and make sure that those barriers that might interfere with effective learning for teachers, that you're not adding to them as a teacher educator, but that you're working towards solutions to overcoming them. So thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed. So if we can move on now to the next theme that we had a look at. Okay, so I'm going to ask Eric, who is with us, I hope. Eric, are you there?
I'm right here. I'm right here, John.
Okay,
Hi.
Fabulous that you're with us. So, Eric, conducting our own research then, what are your initial thoughts on that particular main point that we've picked out?
Thank you so much, John, for inviting me to this webinar. Generally, the tendency has been to think that teacher educators are experts because they train teachers, and they sort of place themselves at a position higher than teachers. And this blurs the relationship, the fruitful relationship that they could establish with teachers who have real-time contact with the classrooms and with the learners. One of the things that I would like to highlight here is that teacher education in general developing in ways that enables the teacher to conceptualize, the precepts teachers to conceptualize teaching. Now, real-time experience and expertise is developed during practice. And one way through which this is developed is agency in teacher association. Now, one of the ways through which we think that it's important for teachers to conduct their own research is that first, it enables them to develop autonomy and more expertise in ways that can enable them develop the ability to make informed decisions on what they are doing, which at a certain point may be at variance with the theoretical knowledge they gain from a teacher education. Excuse me. Now, teacher educators, if they lose sight of this space, it's possible that they're going to train teachers who will not fit in the context in which teachers work, because the context in which teachers work are not static, John. They're dynamic. Things change. We can take an example of COVID. And COVID came in and everybody had to switch to online. And it was assumed, like was earlier said here, that it was assumed that teachers could unproblematically transit into online teaching. But that was done by teachers, not based on the knowledge they gained from the pre-service education. And that is why there is a further need for this interaction between teacher educators and teacher and practitioners. Now, the reason for which we think, another reason for which we think that research both at the level of teacher educators and the practitioners is important is because the processes of building expertise is not a short process. It's a very long process. A journey through which teachers walk. And what happens within that journey is transformational. It is far more than the sessions of lectures and notes that teachers receive in pre-service education. And with all of this, it is very necessary that there are certain competencies which the teachers have developed through their own research, which might not tell the story of pre-service education. So that's why we think that it's necessary for teacher educators to develop their research and also encourage teachers to develop research. Now, the question we may ask is, what type of research? Teacher educators may be involved in action research, maybe involved in academic research, or probably conventional research. But teachers or practitioners themselves are primarily going to be involved in practitioner research, which means they are worried and they are investigating the potential challenges they have or the actual challenges they have in their classroom and seeking ways of understanding, having an in-depth understanding of these challenges. And in ways that enable them to develop contextually grounded ways of sorting out these challenges. And I'm sure that the knowledge that teachers or practitioners gain from this kind of research may not tell the story of pre-service education. And that's why this connection is very relevant. John.
Lovely. Thank you so much indeed, Eric. I've got a few comments to make, but should we hand over to Daniel? Because Daniel, it was your webinar. What are your thoughts on this theme then?
First of all, I'd like to thank Eric for his insightful comment. There's a lot to unpack in what he said. Perhaps one of the points that I'd like to address is the significance of context and how important it is that when we think of research and encouraging teachers, language teachers, to conduct research or at least to engage with published research, we take into consideration the value of research for them as individuals working within a specific context. It was very interesting for me to note at the very beginning of this webinar that the only statement in the pre-webinar poll that registered some negative responses, a level of disagreement, was actually the third statement, the one saying that as teacher educators, we should conduct our own research and encourage teachers to do so. And this makes me think on why, as teacher educators, there are people who feel that this is a problematic statement, that it might be something that they disagree with. One of the reasons could be the use of the modal verb in that statement, the fact that we're saying should rather than can. And they would be right in disagreeing with the statement, because ultimately we should never impose research on anyone, whether it's ourselves or the teachers that we work with. If we feel that research is something valuable for us as teacher educators and might also be valuable for the teachers that we work with, we should always believe in the notion that it has to be something that people do or engage with on a voluntary manner, rather than trying to impose it on anyone. So the issue of it being something that people choose to do willingly, rather than feeling that they are expected to do it, is a crucial one. The other reason for which some people might disagree with that statement could be related to one of the points that I made in my own webinar a few months ago. The first point mentions that as teacher educators, we can help language teachers to broaden the conception of research. And obviously, for us to do that, we ourselves as teacher educators have to broaden our own understanding of what research is. So if research is seen as a very narrow kind of activity, as something that is only associated with what professional researchers and academics do in their own context, in their own university environment, in understanding the classroom and the phenomena in the classroom, then thinking of research only in that way, as that kind of activity, defining it only according to how academics define it, that is problematic, and that might be one of the reasons why people would feel that this is not something that teachers should be encouraged to do. And they would be right in that. So making sure that we broaden our understanding of research as teacher educators, and then help teachers to do the same kind of thing by seeing research as an inclusive activity, as a very democratic kind of activity that people can engage in and engage with, as long as they are also equipped with the right kinds of attitudes, beliefs, and skills. Sometimes when thinking of enabling teachers to do research, we focus solely on the skills that they require in order to do research in an efficient manner, in order for them to be competent teacher researchers. But at the same time, we should also give a lot of value to how those teachers interact with research. What do they think of research and its value? What are their beliefs with respect to research and how it can be beneficial for them as language teachers? And let's not forget, for the people in the classroom, the people in the learning environment, the learners themselves. It might also be a question of not seeing research as something that only belongs to the teacher, if the teacher is choosing to do research, but it is something that can be shared as an activity with the learners themselves. So it becomes something even more inclusive, and the learners and the teacher are working collaboratively in order to understand what's happening in the language classroom, to find answers to the questions that they, as a group of people, have. And then the other important aspect of this, which I also mentioned in the webinar, is that as teacher educators, we can also help people to position themselves as research engaged professionals and believe that through their engagement with research and in research, because there is both the aspect of reading other people's research and doing your own research, then that could potentially be a form of professional development, a means by which language teachers can grow professionally and improve their own practices if such practices require improvement. So to go back to Eric's point about the significance of context, ultimately, if we as teacher educators believe that this is something that would be beneficial for us and for the teachers that we work with, and everyone is ultimately sharing that kind of belief or agreeing that research is something that they wish to engage in, then we should always remember that this is not something that is divorced from the context in which teachers operate, or even the context in which teaching and learning take place. But it is something that is very much bound to that context. And with that, I'd like to hand over to John.
Thank you so much indeed, Daniel and Eric. Stressing the importance there of context is everything, that solutions rooted in practice are likely to be solutions that are longer term and potentially more effective. There's so much in there to think about in relation to research, whether it's engaging with it or engaging in it, the distinction that Daniel made in his webinar. So please do look back at his how-to guide. And also, if you'd like to look in more detail at the points that he was making during his webinar, of course, there's the recording. So if we can move now on to the next topic, that would be good. Thank you very much indeed. So I'm going to hand over now to Mark and to Hala. And they're going to be talking about one of the themes that we covered, which is to do with the nature and level of challenge, barriers to effective online learning.
Thank you very much, John. I hope everyone can hear me. It's really lovely to be back here in the webinar and to continue being part of this community and this ongoing discussion. So, so the topic of the current slide is all about the nature and level of challenge of the range of barriers to effective online teaching. This is something, of course, you know, that I had to battle with, that we all had to battle with when we experienced the pandemic, and it was something that put the fear of God in me when it actually initially happened. Because, you know, those of you who saw my webinar in this series, the emphasis for me is very much on teacher and teacher-student rapport and classroom community. And so my biggest fear was how educators can maintain rapport with students in an online environment. Now, of course, there are all of the, you know, the technical issues that we've all experienced. In fact, I experienced them this morning when I didn't have the latest version of Zoom on my laptop. So I had to leave a couple of times and then come back in again. So, you know, but aside from the, you know, technical problems that we have, you know, how do we facilitate learning in an online environment that, you know, as much as possible can be as effective as face-to-face teaching? So I'd like to hand over to Hala, who can hopefully enlighten us and remind us of some of the things that were mentioned on that webinar. So thank you.
Thanks, Mark, and hi, John, and hello to everyone. In the webinar in the series, we actually talked about 3 different types of barriers. And we ran a short survey with 100 teachers and asked them what is the barrier that they think is the most significant in their context. The 3 barriers were related to competencies, affective barriers, and infrastructure barrier. And the teachers we surveyed agreed that the most significant type of barriers is barriers related to competencies. As teacher educators, I think it's really important for us to understand, fully understand the nature and the different types of barriers that face teachers while engaging in the virtual world. And by doing this, we all realize as teacher educators that supporting teachers tackling the virtual environment is something beyond their ability or familiarity with a specific platform or the digital knowledge and digital competence. It's something beyond that. So, for example, in the webinar, we talked how the teachers might struggle while teaching online, and the anxiety that they feel thinking about accommodating students with SEND within the online environment. And this goes back actually to one of the themes we discussed today earlier in this webinar about an effective teacher in the face-to-face environment isn't automatically an effective teacher in the virtual environment. Also, teachers were worried about running assessment and tracking progress in the online environment. And after everybody were asked to move to shift their teaching to the virtual environment. There were also concerns about motivation and the level of engagement. Teachers who planned lessons well in the face-to-face classes weren't sure if it's the same case when they plan lessons for the online lessons. They needed more support with classroom management, which is quite different from the face-to-face environment. And finally, with the massive knowledge and the massive digital content made available recently on the internet, they were quite overwhelmed and less confident about selecting the right tools. And they kept asking this big question: what is the best tool? What is the best platform? So you can see now from these this list of concerns and fears that teachers struggled dealing with the newly introduced online environment, and it was beyond just knowing a platform or being familiar with a platform or knowing how to open a Zoom session or knowing how to deliver a class on Google Classroom, all of that. And we also introduced in that webinar with my colleagues Lucy and Karen, a number of practical classroom ideas and some top tips for teachers on how to improve their digital literacy, but also on how to improve their online pedagogy and their online professional learning. And we talked about making the content they create more valuable and relevant. And I think as teacher educators, we need to guide the teachers and support them with this point, and keep emphasizing on, when shifting your lessons and you're teaching from face-to-face to online, you need to think about the quality over quantity and the value of your content and the relevance of your content, rather than the length of your lesson and the number of activities you're planning to deliver. Because obviously research has shown that working online is more work. Teaching online is more work than teaching face-to-face. We also talked about how making your content flexible and diverse and using multi-modalities in presenting your content is useful for your learners and yourself. Also, we talked about the value of giving feedback timely and frequently and constructively using various methods. We talked about gamification, setting routines, and we also talked about being democratic online and giving your learners a voice and a choice, actually. It was interesting also in this webinar to share what the research has said recently about the effective barriers that teachers face while working online. And a survey done in 2021 has shown that teachers agreed that working online takes more hours and effort and planning than working face-to-face. And also, when the teachers were surveyed and were asked how they would characterize their own experience with distance learning, they said that it requires a lot of effort and to make this new model of work effective. We also talked about some top tips to support teachers with their effective barriers, and how to overcome obstacles that come from their feeling of if they lack the confidence or their feeling of anxiety. And we encouraged the teachers as teacher educators to set their priorities and know their priorities quite well and be quite clear about them, and given the limited time and space in the virtual environment, you need to focus on the top priorities you need to deliver, the top priority learning outcomes in your curriculum to cover. You need to give yourself a time to ask for help. And it's always useful and good to try out something before you use it actually in your virtual lesson with the students. Be also realistic about your expectations. And we also gave the teachers some online tools that they might find useful in managing their time and managing their work-life balance, such as Slack, Trello, To-Do List, Google Drive, Focus Keeper, and Evernote. These are online tools for teachers to manage their priorities and organize their to-do lists.
I can hear that cockerel crowing in the background.
It's a Cairo noise.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. That's lovely. So much in there, Mark and Hala. And again, please go back to the webinar recordings and have a look through some of those points around anxiety, around competence, around infrastructure problems, some of those top tips. Importantly, though, I think Hala is saying we need to invest time to become better at supporting teachers in that online environment, and not to make assumptions, as Simon was suggesting at the beginning. Okay, then if we can move on now to the next theme, please. Okay, so perhaps if we can go straight in here to think about with Mark, if you're still there, Mark, if you could just quickly remind us about some of the points that you mentioned in the webinar relevant to the idea around whole person focus rather than a sole focus on transactional skills. Mark, are you still with us?
Yeah, I am. Yeah, can you hear me okay, John?
Certainly can, yes.
Okay, right, yes, I heard the emphasis on quickly, so I will quickly give you an overview of some of the things I covered. But I mean, I'd like to start off by saying actually that listening to everybody this morning so far, there is clearly a thread that runs through all of these different topics that we've discussed and looked at, and that is the importance of human interaction and maintaining relationships with our, teacher educators, and of course, ultimately, our learners. So to give you a kind of a quick, a broad overview of the topics I covered, I started by looking at, first of all, what motivates teachers to go into the profession in the first place. And I highlighted some very recent newspaper headlines that said things like, a record number of teachers are leaving the profession or thinking of leaving the profession. Misogyny towards female teachers in British schools is at an all-time high. Things like teachers having to wear body cams, similar to the ones that the police have to wear, in order to monitor discipline and antisocial behavior in schools. So there are all kinds of problems that teachers have, especially those who work in the state sector around the world. And so, so I began by saying, well, why do we go into this profession in the first place if we know that there are all these pressures on teachers? And the overriding response that I've got from the British Council survey and other surveys that I've conducted elsewhere is that teachers, by and large, consider it a vocation. They go into the profession for the love of their subject and for the love of the thought that they will increase life chances of young people. So clearly it's a vocation. So the emphasis is very much on, the relationship, the rapport that teachers are able to build with their learners. So what I talked about in my webinar was how teachers can maintain motivation and resilience. Now, one of the things I mentioned refers to what's known as decision latitude, and that is the amount of decision-making powers that teachers have within their educational institution. And very often, teachers don't have much decision latitude. In other words, lots of decisions about their workload, what they teach, how they teach, etc. These decisions are made by other people. And this, of course, puts additional pressure on teachers themselves. So if these decisions are taken out of their hands, how can they continue enjoying their work? How can they maintain their resilience and motivation and ultimately flourish in their jobs and want to continue doing it? So my main thesis really in my webinar was that, well, one thing we can really focus on is creating a conducive classroom environment in which the learning process is enjoyable, that everybody is respectful of each other inside the classroom, that teachers can place, a greater emphasis on the rapports between teacher and students and between students themselves. And that, and I sort of offered a few practical tips, and that, includes, when we educate our teachers, excuse me, to get them to be much more self-reflective, to monitor their own teaching carefully, and this can be done through peer observation or videos, and just think about how much associating is done during their classes. In other words, okay, we're language teachers, we teach grammar, we teach vocabulary, we develop skills and all the rest of it. But how much emphasis during lesson time is put on so-called associating in terms of the kinds of questions that we ask our students, in terms of how we get to know them, and how we get to find out what their interests are and what their motivations are and that kind of thing. And so in my webinar, I offered certain practical techniques and approaches that we can pass on to our teacher trainees to help, you know, encourage them focus much more on these really, really important aspects of all teaching, regardless of the actual subject.
Thank you so much indeed, Mark.
Okay, John.
I'm sorry to cut you off there. I could carry on listening to you all day. I think what you're saying about decisional attitude brings us neatly, perhaps, onto our next theme, which is to do with agency and expertise that teacher associations might be able to contribute to, as well as all of the other areas that you mentioned about encouraging and thinking about rapport and relationships and about continuing to be self-reflective. Eric, if I can go straight to you, could you, in a few sentences, just sum up your main thesis, your main arguments about how teacher associations are able to develop and support that agency that you like to talk about?
Yes, John, thank you so much. Would you like me to have my video on?
Yes, please. Yeah, it's always nice to see you, Eric, of course. Yes,
Great.
please.
Well, while that is being sorted, it looks like I can't do it. Only the host can start my video, but I'll keep talking. There are significant ways through which teacher associations can develop practitioner expertise. And like I said in my previously, teachers leave the training institutions with awareness, with conceptualizations of teaching. And the expertise that they develop as teachers is most often generated by participation, agency in professional development activities, like in teacher association, attending conferences, webinars, and being encouraged to take on reflective practices. And one of the things that I said in my guide is that building from secondary research and my experience in primary research, initiatives, teachers get involved in initiatives rather than sporadic activities. They can quickly develop expertise, especially if the initiative encourage the teachers to reflect on their own practices within their own context. And again, permit me come back to this idea of context. Context is not just the word. It values a cultural artifact which teachers experience within the classroom. And these are things that when the teacher gets involved in initiatives, we help them interrogate their own practices and develop ways of knowing and undoing practices that don't fit well within the context in which they find themselves. And like I said, initiatives like things that can enable teachers to plan lessons together, teach the lessons, share the successes and the failures of the lessons, reflect on them, conduct teacher research on areas they find practically problematic in the classroom, not the kind of research that is theoretical, but research that enables them to have an in-depth understanding of the nature of their classroom and their learners and the ways their learners learn. These are ways through which teachers can develop expertise. And sometimes it's difficult to think that expertise can be developed through a workshop or a simple webinar. In my own perspective, these are important in the sense that they trigger a sense of inquiry and they trigger a sense of professional development in the teachers. But the real-time expertise is developed through a total commitment and involvement in ways that learning occurs in the classroom, taking into consideration the contextual resources and the constraints. So in summary, John, if you permit, initiatives that are developed with teachers' willingness to commit themselves to this initiative enable them to develop expertise more.
Eric, I am so sorry to cut you off there. Like I was saying with Mark, we could listen for much longer about that. You raised such important points there that really cut to the heart of what it is that we're trying to do and as teacher educators in the support of teachers. And it comes back a little bit to what Mark was saying about developing that lifelong approach to professional development, the continual self-reflection, the continual search for solutions to, as you say, real-world contextualize challenges that teachers face, and how we can help as teacher educators to support that. If we come now to our very last theme, then I'm going to invite Phil to talk a little bit more, but briefly, if that's possible, Phil, to talk a little bit more about this particular area, the very, very important distinction you made between the social and medical model of disability when you were talking to teacher educators about supporting teachers who have learners with particular difficulties, let's say.
Okay, thanks, John, and I will be brief because I know we're already kind of out of time as well. And I think the first point I want to make is, and it's already been said, and Mark really highlighted this, is that we our themes are interlinked, you know, and when we talk about inclusion, we're actually talking about all the things that we've already been talking about, and the importance of research about teacher identity, about the whole person approach and the whole learner approach, and the ways we work online, offline. So all these are actually about inclusion now, and we need to understand that. On the particular point now, in the research we did, you know, we asked teacher educators about their approach to inclusion and inclusive practices, and of course everyone would say they either are or their aspiration is to be an inclusive teacher, and I think all teachers and most teachers that's what they believe. Although it's not always that that plays itself out so easily in practice. Yeah? And so when we're thinking specifically about special educational needs, you know, I think we need to understand that learners who are identified with a particular SEND, whether it's a dyslexia or on the autism spectrum or social emotional needs or whatever, they're learners like all learners. They just have specific needs, and now you know, I'm not in any way trying to undermine the importance of a kind of medical diagnosis, and I'm definitely not you know, there's all sorts of medical interventions that may actually be actually appropriate and right, and teachers need to work with other professionals on that. But I think the main point I'd like to say really is that our role as teacher educators and working with teachers is to provide educational answers and solutions. And this is why we actually promote what we call the actual social model rather than a medical model. And a medical model would tend to focus on what's wrong and what's wrong with the learner, while the social model really says, well, it's our systems that we have to change and work with, and as educational professionals, we work through educational answers, you know, and I think that's what the main point really about the difference between this medical model thinking and social model. And it's just so easy to fall into the medicalization of our learners' problems, and I think we, you know, in terms of working with teachers, we need to kind of work on this shift, and it is a shift. It's not, you know, and inclusion, like anything else, takes time. Yeah. Just to be very brief, just say you know, this was a very important part of what I talked about in terms of research, also based on the work that we've been doing in the council over, you know, Oxford University Press and Cambridge University Press, and you can read the research. The practical application was something I called the 10 top approaches, which was a kind of framework to actually support teachers in thinking about how we can promote inclusive practices. And this covered areas like scaffolding, differentiation, multisensory approaches, assessment for learning, and many other aspects, which of course you can read in the research or even watch the webinar. But this was a framework to help teacher educators and therefore teachers to look at what might be appropriate inclusive practices and the right interventions. I think the last point I'd just like to make is that, of course, this was all made on the basis of looking at global good practice, and that's what we have to do. But actually, all interventions inevitably are local and need to be based on the local needs of our learners and our context. And so that if that's okay, quickly is really what my research and my webinar was all about.
Thank you so much indeed, Phil. Well, throughout this 1 hour session, I think we've demonstrated that there's a lot to think about, isn't there? If we're going to be that role model, if we're going to really support the professional development of teachers as teacher educators ourselves, there are so many different things that we need to be thinking about. And whether it comes to how to be successful within the online environment, how to make sure that our own behavior doesn't lead to discrimination in the training room, for example, how our work with teachers who've got particular questions and issues with their learners who are experiencing difficulties that Phil was talking about, a focus on agency and the role of teacher associations, how to help teachers beyond basic transactional skills, about pedagogical skills in the classroom, how to help them to remain motivated throughout their career. This, I could go on. There are so many different areas, and we would very much like you to go back to the session recordings for this first webinar series, to go back to the research that we've made available that support the learning through those webinars, and to take the opportunity to review and to reflect some of these very, very interesting themes that we've looked at in the first series. This is the first series, and of course, as you might imagine, we're going to have a second series, and I'm going to take another 5 minutes of your valuable time, if that's okay, just to tell you what is coming up for series 2 for teacher educators. So in April, self-directed learning. We think this is a very, very, very important part of what it is that teacher educators can do to help teachers, i.e. to help them become autonomous in their learning. May, big topic, of course, at the moment, ChatGPT will be looking at artificial intelligence and what that means in terms of opportunities and also in terms of challenges. In June, we're going to have a look at translanguaging, which is essentially the idea of switching dynamically between languages in the classroom. So we're going to be talking about that and how to harness the power of translanguaging, how to understand it. We're going to come back to this very, very important theme about research, yes, about both engaging in and engaging with research. We're going to have a look at that in July. Another really, really important way that teacher educators can help teachers is by encouraging collaborative learning. So we're going to be having a look at collaborative learning for ourselves. How does collaborative learning work? How does peer-to-peer learning work for teacher educators? In September, we're going to have a look at a little bit more transactional stuff. We're going to have a look at what are the considerations for teacher educators when it comes to planning CPD programs for teachers. What do they need to think about? What are some of the principles involved? And then moving swiftly on, if we may, okay, October, looking at social media and the role of social media or social media groups, at any rate, within teacher development, how that might work. In November, we're going to be looking at how it is that we can, help subject teachers who teach through English. So not a focus on English language teachers so much, or teaching English as a subject, but we're going to look at how we as teacher educators can help those subject teachers who use the medium of English in their instruction. Come back to the issue of gender. We're going to come back to the issue of digital literacy and deconstruct that and understand it and reflect on it. We're going to finish in February with what we think is particularly important. Teachers who come into the profession at the early stages of their careers, how can we as teacher educators really help them, take them under our wing and ensure that they develop that lifelong motivation that we've been talking about. And we'll come back in March, as we have done this March, for a webinar review. Thank you so much indeed. Please go to our website, look at the recordings, look at the research, get in touch with us if you've got ideas for themes that you think we ought to be covering in this series for teacher educators. Have a very enjoyable rest of the day, and thank you so much to everybody that's joined us here today, all of our previous presenters, all of the people that helped to organize this webinar, and you yourselves for joining us. Thank you and take care. Goodbye, everybody. Bye-bye.